All right. So we can start and wait
Yeah,
for the Professor Parker to join in if like he
sure.
is available and also if it's okay for the fix all the technical issues. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are. So my name is Sheldon, the research fellow at the Center for Globalization Hong Kong, the CGHK. I'm also the international conference coordinator of this panel. So the CGHK is one of the like unprecedented and also the independent Hong Kong-based think tanks that perform policy research and provides strategic policy consultation service for private and foreign enterprises and governmental agencies. Besides, the CGHK is also like the platform incorporating scholars and practitioners, that's like you guys were sitting here, with diverse backgrounds to exchange their perspectives, which contributes to the policymakers and the entrepreneurs having a better picture of ongoing geopolitical dynamics. So that's why we're hosting this really important U.S.-China strategic dialogue series titled "After the APEC Summit: What new competitive landscape will U.S.-China relations present?" In the wake of the APEC summit and the crucial meeting between the U.S. President Biden and the President of the PRC, Xi Jinping, we stand at a pivotal moment, as you can see in history, where the outcomes of the summit will definitely shape the future of the landscape of this bilateral relationship. The implications of the summit are vast and far-reaching, as it set the tone for the next phase of the U.S.-China competition. So the critical questions loomed large, and such as what key issues do both sides agree upon, or where do they diverge? Under the tension of this complex rivalry, how can both sides can effectively manage the sensitive areas like export controls or chips or development of AI? So moreover, the broader implication of this discussion extend beyond the scope of the geopolitics. And we dive into this intricate matters. We cannot overlook the impending 2024 elections were in the approaching years, like especially the Taiwan elections in January and the U.S. presidential election in the November next 2024. So it is also interesting to consider how this pivotal events will interplay the ongoing U.S.-China dynamic. So our aim to comprehend this complexity of this relationship by leveraging our unique geographic position in the Greater Bay Area. So through this dialogue series, we try to bridge the gap in policy understanding and between the U.S. and China, drawing insights from this esteemed scholar and practitioners from both sides. Here, I'm honored to introduce today's distinguished panelists and guests, Mrs. Bonnie Glazer, who is the managing director of the Indo-Pacific program at German Marshall Fund of the United States, and Dr. Thomas Parker, who is also the professional lecturer in the security studies at the George Washington University, and my alma mater, and also just former policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department. And from the Chinese side, we have Professor Jia Qingguo, who is the former dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University, and Professor Zhu Feng is the executive dean of the School of International Studies at Nanjing University. Last but not least, we have our moderator for today's strategic dialogue, Dr. Peter Chiu, who served as the chairman of the CGHK and professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. So in the following hour and a half, we aim to unravel this complexity and seek insights and foster some robust discussion that shed the light on the way forward in U.S.-China relations. So I'm going to stop here. There's a few of the abundant introductions, and we'll turn the floor to our chairman of the CGHK, Dr. Chiu. He would give his brief remarks and moderates the following discussions. Dr. Chiu, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheldon.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, guys. Yeah, very happy to host this forum. We're all old friends, good friends. You know, as I was joking, nowadays the biggest strategic goal is try to survive in every regard. So the summit is over. Finally, the summit is over. Now the big question is, was it success or was it a failure? If yes, why? If no, why? or was it limited success? Was it limited failure? Or in which areas there was agreement, and particularly in terms of, especially since we try to compare what's going on last year in Bali, this was huge success. And due to the balloon crisis at the beginning of this year, all of a sudden, everything was blocked. So the big question is, if limited success came up yesterday, will that be, is this going to be sustainable? Do we see some tools and means, try to make sure that such kind of incident like balloon crisis at the beginning of this year won't happen again over the course of the next few months or maybe last year? So there's a bunch of questions. So I would suggest maybe one by one, each panelist, you guys give us 4 or 5 minutes presentation, try to elaborate your view and your takes. Then we start with a panel discussion. So ladies first, let's start with Bonnie. Now it's your turn.
Well, thank you for having me, Peter, to discuss the latest summit between President Biden and Xi Jinping. I think that the United States set expectations quite low for this summit, and their expectations were met. It is important to note that officials on both sides did work very hard in advance of this summit to produce some outcomes. And you can find, for example, if you compare the readouts that both sides issued after their meetings, you can find some overlapping language in those readouts. And that was actually negotiated between the two sides. So if you run a comparison, you'll find some repetition. And I'll highlight one important line that is very important to the United States, and that is that the countries should responsibly manage the competitive elements of the bilateral relationship. This is something that the United States has been saying for some time. The United States says the relationship is predominantly competitive and that we have to prevent competition from escalating into conflict. And the Chinese side does not accept the fact that the relationship is predominantly competitive. We heard Xi Jinping say that in his speech, which he delivered to members of the business community and other audiences afterwards in the evening. But nevertheless, China and the United States have at least come to an understanding that we should responsibly manage the competition. The Chinese side put out afterwards in its statement what is being referred to as the San Francisco vision. And there's only one element of the 5 components of that vision that I would say we disagree on. So we agree we should effectively manage differences, we should advance mutually beneficial cooperation. Even as we compete, we should cooperate where our interests overlap. We should shoulder major country responsibilities. I think both countries would agree that we both have responsibilities we should shoulder, and we should promote people-to-people exchanges. But I think what we don't agree on is the correct recognition of the relationship. That's where we disagree. And I think we will continue to disagree on that. But perhaps we can set that aside and we can focus on responsibly managing our differences. So from the U.S. perspective, the major, what we usually call deliverables or achievements is first the agreement by Beijing to work with the United States to stop the flow of precursor chemicals to Mexico, which are being manufactured then into fentanyl and being shipped to the United States. That's become the biggest killer of Americans between the ages of 18 and 49. And this is really important for President Biden as he enters the presidential campaign to show to the American people that he's doing something about this major threat to Americans. And I think the United States is really quite pleased that China's already issued a circular of instructions to companies about what they should stop doing. and there have been some chemical companies that have already been shut down. So we're seeing some early deliverables in terms of actually implementing this agreement, and the United States is really quite grateful. The resumption of the military-to-military dialogue is also, I think, it's a win for both countries, but it was a big ask of the United States. And as you know, after our former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, went to Taiwan, there were three elements of the military relationship that were suspended, and those are now restored. And this could not come at a more important time, because we are seeing more and more near misses, dangerous encounters, call them close calls or unprofessional behavior, whatever words you'd like to use. We had an incident just a few weeks ago where a Chinese, I believe it was a J-11 fighter, was within 10 feet of a B-52. That is just too dangerous. So we will be resuming what we call the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement. That's the operational safety discussions that we have with the PLA. And I hope that they will actually produce some understandings about how to prevent accidents going forward. And then finally, there is, of course, advances on climate. I won't go into that in detail, but I'm glad to see there's a working group that's established. We're going to work together in the run-up to COP28. And our two countries are going to start talking about artificial intelligence and the dangers of AI in military systems. We have not come to any agreement yet, but I think that this is a really important topic. It's really a multilateral conversation, but the United States and China could also talk about this issue bilaterally. So I think this is a set of outcomes that both countries can be proud of. I hope that we have, in fact, put a firm floor under the relationship, that we will not see further deterioration. But I have to say, Peter, we cannot rule out the possibility that we see another unexpected event, whether it's a balloon or something else. There will be things that are unexpected in our relationship. There could even be accidents, even if they are unwanted. And we have to have in place the mechanisms to manage them and the political will to use those mechanisms, including secure crisis communications between our military officers and between our civilian leaders. But I think that this was a successful summit. It did not transform the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think any of us expected that it would. It did not restore mutual trust, because that can't be done overnight. And even achieving that may not happen. But nevertheless, there have been some really important accomplishments, and hopefully over the course of the coming year, where the United States will be in a presidential campaign, a little bit more domestically focused, and also dealing with the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza, if they do not come to an end, hopefully we can preserve stability in the U.S.-China relationship.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. So let me ask you a very general question. Looking at what happened last year after the summit in Bali, now, today, one day after the summit in San Francisco, have you become more optimistic in terms of U.S.-China relations, or have you become less optimistic?
Well, I'm not sure I like that word optimistic, because you have to say optimistic that what can happen. I'm hopeful that we can, that both of our countries are sufficiently invested in what we have achieved in San Francisco, in managing our differences, in cooperating where we have interests that overlap, that we can continue to do both of those things. Those are the most important things, I think. Cooperate where we can, and manage our differences. And we are going to face some difficult challenges ahead. Taiwan's elections might be one of them. We don't know, but we have to be willing to engage in dialogue when we have challenges and when we have differences, and find ways to manage them. We can't expect to resolve things.
Sure.
So I think what I'd like to say is that we're in a good place. We're in about the best place that I think we can be, given the many, many differences that we have between our two countries, and the differences even of interest in some ways, and the really intensely competitive dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship, which are going to endure, and we have to manage that too.
Okay, I asked this obviously very simplified question not because I used to be a journalist, but because I do see some theoretical strategic trap after the summit yesterday. Because as you mentioned before, the United States stressed we are competitive, we have competition, which China denies. Don't you think we have no ground? We have no theoretical ground at all. The United States says, we are competitive, we are competitor. Simply because we are competitor, we need to set up a guardrail, we need to set up a framework, we need a traffic light, we need rules. But China says, no, we're not competitive. We don't have any ground, Everything's become even more vague. So I don't see any ground for furthermore setting up a traffic light, rules, guardrails. Maybe I might be wrong. So Tom, now it's your turn.
Well, thank you very much.
3-4 minutes for your own presentation.
Right.
Give your takes.
Yeah, I'll make it brief because I think Bonnie has said most of what needs to be said. I think the summit was a successful one. It wasn't a surprise, but I think the two sides decided some time ago that they wanted to set a floor below which the relations would not get worse. And they set up a series of meetings in which U.S. officials would go to China, Chinese officials would come to the U.S., and it would culminate in the meeting that just took place. So again, I think all of it wasn't a surprise, but it showed from the start that both sides wanted to, kind of tamp things down. They didn't want tensions to get out of hand. And I think both of them succeeded in doing that. There's some speculation over here among some of my former government colleagues that President Xi, he's facing some difficult economic conditions. And so, one more reason why he wouldn't want to get things out of hand, wouldn't have things get out of hand. But independent of that, I think he has an interest, as does President Biden, to keep things under control, and I think both leaders did that. That's kind of the bottom line that I see.
Okay, so generally speaking, success because two sides needs each other. Okay, Qingguo, your turn. What's your take?
Oh, thank you. Well, I agree with the two previous speakers that the summit was a success. In fact, probably more than a success. Judging by the low expectations we had before that. So there are quite a number of tangible results, as Bonnie listed. First, mill talks finally got restored and sanctioned by the two governments, and also the two leaders confirmed their commitment to continue with the existing dialogues in other areas, and also we agree on control the fentanyl to help the U.S. to alleviate its challenge and problem, and also the two leaders endorsed people-to-people exchange, and actually President Xi mentioned that he wants to invite 50,000 Americans, young people, to come to visit to study in China. However, despite there are many other areas of common understandings, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman. So it is a success, but at the same time, I think the future remains quite uncertain. There are many challenges and obstacles for future development of the relationship. You have the structural conflicts, like ideological differences, political differences in political systems, which just got attention by recent remark by President Biden. Again, he was asked about whether he was a dictator. He said he believed he is, but because the political systems are different. And also there is huge amount of distrust between the two sides, despite the improved atmosphere, especially on the U.S. side. I think a lot of people, especially on the Republican side, are very critical. People like Mike Gallagher and Mark Rubio, they're open, challenging the need to hold such summit, and this is going to continue. And of course, we are facing also domestic challenges, political challenges, like the election in the U.S. If history is of any guidance, during a presidential election, the candidates would compete to be tougher on China, on the China policy. And that probably would also bring some political difficulties. And finally, I don't know. I think the general trajectory of the development of the relationship toward confrontation has not been fully stopped. So is this a historical turning point, or just a respite before another round of deterioration of the relationship? It's a question that we have to take it very seriously. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Qingguo. Since Zhu Fu needs to leave earlier, try to catch up with the railway. So, please, you got to open up your voice.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me. So it's a great pleasure. Basically, I see the concluded summit meeting seemed to be productive and also constructive. As Bonnie mentioned, a couple of the progress made by both sides. It's not just resumption of the mill dialogue and engagement. It's also, is a very highly required, the movement, both sides should just work on. There's a lot of requirement for the good seamanship, good firemanship. So their mill relationship is really, I think, some sort of a ground where such a good seamanship, a good firemanship could be guaranteed. Then second, we'll see fentanyls, consensus finally, and then eventually reached out. So both sides will resume some sort of anti-drug, cooperation. It has been suspended nearly 7 years. So it's also, I think, a very obvious, progress. I think both leaders just made. But what just interests me most is some sort of good atmosphere creating. So then I read the reports by the Wall Street Journal. It just very impressively mentioned. So some of the meeting dial back, hatred and even just complaints on both sides. I think it's truly deserving more attention. So I see the Americans-China feeling is really getting deteriorating very remarkably. Then China's American view is full of some sort of nationalistic and even populist sentiments. So summit meeting finally inject some sort of a reasonable components into our thinking, our feeling to each other. I think that would be very sensible and also very, very praisable. Final points I want to say is this. Yes, no one knows what will happen next year. It's America's election year. It's Taiwan's election year. But last night, Zheng Hai, Peter and me, we had a very interesting dialogue online. So Peter also released a very earth-shocking, news about she's, some sort of a guarantee to the American counterpart. If it is true,
Yes.
I think it's also a very remarkable achievement, and both sides should be applauded a lot. My last point is, yes, I hope the dialogue and political engagement could continue come down path, no matter how the real feeling and the sentiment does not just finally and eventually change. But we need to create some sort of new friendly atmosphere. But the problem is, what just shocked me is both sides really have a highly disproportionate expectation for results of the summit meeting. So China's top leader, emphasized a couple of times the White House should make a choice between a partner and adversary. And he just pointed out that we are never been an adversary. We should be back to the track of a partner. But to be honest, I don't think U.S. will just take China out of the definition of adversary. But it's some sort of time-consuming, job. So if we both sides could just work together, so then we can de-escalate some sort of hostility and also keep our relations manageable, then that kind of adversary probably will be less risky and some sort of safer. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, all you guys. But you guys, you look very optimistic, which I'm not. You guys, you're sitting actually in White House or in Zhongnanhai advising the political leaders. Actually, I was joking. Why I'm not so optimistic like you guys? First of all, as I mentioned before, I don't see any bottom line. And in terms of bottom line, I don't see any theoretical consensus ground for in terms of whether we're competitors or not. If we don't have this consensus, say we don't have any intention to set up any guardrail or traffic light, try to manage our competition or conflict risk. And also after the summit yesterday, I don't see any uplines, hope for uplines in terms of how we can manage that something like balloon crisis at the beginning of this year won't happen again over the course of next weeks, next months. So in terms of the improvement, as you guys all mentioned before, I would put all these improvements as tactical approach, tactical progress in terms of that both sides need each other, no matter in which regard, in terms of election, in terms of Chinese economy. But since this is, if I'm right, since this is all this pragmatical approach, because we need each other, and all these pragmatical approach or improvements could be changed, could be top down at any time, as long as we don't see any hopes of a mechanism of how to manage that some incident as balloon crisis won't happen again next year. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but maybe we can go back to this point, which I do think is the really, really, substantial point. But in terms of Taiwan, as Su Feng mentioned before, Bonnie, you wrote a very influential article in New York Times. The title was, "No, Xi is not about to attack Taiwan." And yesterday, we were told that Xi mentioned this point before. He actually confirmed what you wrote in New York Times. he very clearly asked, the guys in White House, hey, do you guys really believe that we'll attack Taiwan between 2027 to 2035? Our reporter, my former colleagues of Phoenix, Wang Bingru, she told me that she told Mr. Biden clearly, we have no planning. We never have a planning to attack Taiwan for the period of time between 2027 and 2035. So which actually, again, as I mentioned before, confirmed what you wrote for New York Times. So if this news is true, then it's a big point, which means the war risks of Taiwan Strait can be ruled out, at least if we trust. Any potential military conflict between the United States and China, two nuclear powers, could be, generally speaking, ruled out for the next 10, 15 years, if I'm right. So actually, Bonnie, what's your take? How did you predict that she is not about attack Taiwan?
Well, let me first comment. Comment on what I heard that Xi Jinping told President Biden. There was a backgrounder by a senior U.S. official to members of the media after the summit meeting. And there were several points that the senior official conveyed about Taiwan and what Xi Jinping said. One was what you said, that Xi Jinping said he has no plan to attack Taiwan. But he also said that at some point, the objective is reunification and the issue of Taiwan has to be resolved. And reportedly, he also said something about the conditions under which he would be forced to actually use military force against Taiwan. I didn't hear what those details were, but nonetheless, I think Xi Jinping is telling us he has red lines. He doesn't want to use force, but he could be put in a position where he would be compelled to do so. So I think that's a more comprehensive, maybe, readout of some of the things that he said on Taiwan. And again, this was shared with me by reporters who received this background briefing from a senior official. What I argued in my New York Times article is really consistent with a message that I have been giving for the better part of a year and a half, I think, since Admiral Davidson, the former commander of the Indo-PACOM Command, testified before Congress and said that China could attack within 6 years. And I have, in many places, I've participated in debates, I've written many articles, I've co-authored a book that addresses this and other issues pertaining to Taiwan. And essentially, I believe that, yes, there are circumstances in which China would use force. If Taiwan declares independence, if the United States were to recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state, I believe that China would use force. But that said, I don't think that this is Xi Jinping's preference. I think he remains committed to the policy of peaceful development across the strait. But let's be clear that peaceful also includes lots of coercion, economic, military, and diplomatic coercion, and other forms of pressure. So, China's definition of peaceful is like anything short of kinetic use of force. And so my view is that China has a strategy of essentially using these tactics and these tools, part of which is disinformation, to be quite frank, to convince the people of Taiwan that the United States would never defend Taiwan, so they might as well give up now and get a better deal from China. When Russia invaded Ukraine, part of the message that China was sending to Taiwan was that the United States didn't put troops on the ground in Ukraine. They're not going to come rescue you either. So this is part of the messaging that we are seeing coming from Beijing. And so China has, I think, a fairly sophisticated strategy and prefers to win without fighting, as Sun Tzu would say. So I think that what I said in the New York Times article, just very briefly in a couple of sentences, is that recent developments have induced even greater caution in Xi Jinping's calculus. The downturn in China's economy, the corruption at high levels in China's military, and Xi Jinping's lack of confidence in his own military, and the performance of Russia and its forces in Ukraine. I think all three developments have likely induced greater caution in Xi Jinping's calculus. So I think he was, even before these three things happened, that Xi Jinping was likely, he likely appreciated the risks and the potential costs of using force against Taiwan. But I think now there is even greater certainty. How long this will last, we don't know. But bottom line is that if China's red lines are crossed and Xi Jinping is essentially pushed into a corner, I believe that he would order the use of force.
Okay, Qingguo or Tom?
I'll just briefly say, with respect to what China might do, I think the prospect of an actual invasion over the next 10 years or longer is, I think, very small. I mean, it's a huge military undertaking. What you might see if China really wanted to up the military pressure is periodic harassment of shipping going in and out of Taiwan. That's something that's, maybe conceivable, but at this point, I think certainly unlikely. But it's a scenario that I think both of our countries probably think about from time to time. The comments by Admiral Davidson. Military leaders tend to think in worst case scenarios, is my experience. I suspect it's the same thing in China. I think it's certainly the same thing. It's the case in the United States. It's not that they're looking for a fight, but, at the end of the day, what they're paid to do is deal with a military challenge and possible armed hostilities. So they tend to think a bit more pessimistically than I think, your average diplomat. So yes, Admiral Davidson said that, and military leaders will sometimes think along those lines, but he's not speaking for the entire U.S. government. I think that's the case. And again, picking up on what Professor Qingguo said, yes, I think there probably will be certain deterioration of relations. I think to some degree that comes with the territory. We're the two most powerful countries in Asia. There is a natural rivalry, which is not going to go away. And as you point out, we have an election coming up. President Trump, we can expect, will be unusually, particularly strident and outspoken. So yes, that'll cause the relationship to be a little more tense. But these elections come and go, and the election year itself tends to be tense, but it doesn't speak for the rest of the 3 years period. So you have to be a little patient with the United States when it comes to these elections.
Okay, Qingguo, what's your take on what President Xi mentioned yesterday in terms of no plan to attack Taiwan? And the body just elaborate all these preconditions, bottom lines, scenarios, maybe yes, maybe not. Yeah, so what's your take? This is actually very significant for the people all around the world to judge.
Well, I'm not surprised. I think we don't have a plan to take over Taiwan by force, other than under extreme circumstances. Okay, the extreme circumstances are like Taiwan declares independence or moves to de jure independence. Taiwan develops nuclear weapons, and Taiwan is occupied by foreign forces. Okay, So these are the conditions that for China to use force that President Jiang Shangkun listed many years ago. Okay. And I think they remain valid. Also, there's another reason to expect that China would continue its peaceful unification policy. That is, according to the anti-secession law of China, Taiwan is still part of a sovereign territory of China. So the current relationship across the Taiwan Strait is one of a de facto one country, two systems. So the separation between the two sides is political separation resulting from civil war. Okay. If that's the case, then there is no such a hurry to deal with a domestic issue by force. And I believe also there is another motivation, that is, if you look at the changing balance across the Taiwan Strait in terms of power and capabilities, it has changed so much in favor of the mainland side. So, of course, you have some economic difficulties at the time, at this moment, but then in the long run, you should have confidence to achieve a peaceful unification over time, as long as Taiwan does not strive for independence. So, if you look at history, every Chinese leader wanted immediate unification, political unification from Mao's time, and every time they decided, probably will have to wait for a better time. And this time, I think too, we need probably to wait for a better time when China is stronger and more attractive to Taiwan residents.
Oh, thank you. So actually, now I'm getting slightly optimistic. Since you guys all mentioned, preconditions for these scenarios, as Bonnie, as Tom mentioned before, and Qingguo said, yes, there's some preconditions. As long as Taiwan didn't claim independence, as long as Taiwan won't be occupied by foreign forces, and so on and so on. So I do see hopes for some consensus ground for setting up a sort of strategic framework or framework for strategic reassurance between the United States and China for some scenarios, which I put as long as there was no independence, and then it's up to us to define what is independence. As long as Taiwan won't be occupied by foreign forces, as Qingguo mentioned before, can we set up this can we start with this between China and the United States? Try to say, hey, let's try to, I don't know who phrased that, maybe James Steinbrück many years ago, strategic reassurance between China and the United States. Can we start with here? As I mentioned before, there's no theoretical ground for whether we are competitive or not, as we saw yesterday. And there's no mechanism set up, try to avoid any kind of incident to happen, like balloon crisis, as we saw yesterday. But I do see some hopes, try to set up a framework or ground for strategic reassurance for Taiwan Strait, for some kind of scenarios, for how many, as long as, as Qingguo mentioned before, then maybe the United States can try to make efforts with China, try to set up a framework for all these scenarios, as long as, all these scenarios, as long as can be maintained, can be guaranteed, then the status quo over Taiwan Strait can be maintained for some period of time, for a certain period of time, maybe for 20, 30 years. Am I too optimistic or too naive, Donnie, or Tom, or Qingguo? I don't know whether Su Hui is still online. Maybe he's on the way to High Railway.
Well, I think the strategic reassurance would be nice, but it's very difficult to attain in reality. In rhetoric, I think it's there. Every part on the Taiwan side, Taiwan has been saying that it's not seeking to change the status quo. Even the DPP leader is saying that, despite the fact that it has a party platform to fight for independence. And on the U.S. side, the U.S. has been saying that it will stick to the one China policy. On the Chinese side, Chinese has been saying that we are continue with the peaceful unification policy. But the devil is on the ground. DPP is seeking to promote independence from the taking measures. At least people on the mainland find it very difficult to accept. And also, Beijing is preparing for a scenario in which Taiwan may seek independence. And that involves a lot of efforts to increase defense and military capabilities. And the U.S. side, in order to assure that Taiwan is not pressured into surrender, has been, stepping up diplomatic and political and also military support to Taiwan. So on the ground, you see efforts to make this reassurance sound very abstract. So it's very difficult. But reassurance we must, especially between China and the U.S. We are not supposed to fight a war over this issue. We should, well, at the moment, we're talking about guardrails. Guardrails, I think it's a good idea, especially to avoid a military accident-led war between China and the U.S. But military guardrail is not enough. I think we need political guardrails. Would the U.S. offer the political guardrails for China? It would not support, endorse, it would oppose Taiwan independence. How that would come if the U.S. can assure us that Taiwan would not, it would strongly oppose Taiwan independence together with China. Then China would feel much more comfortable strategically, and probably we can reach some kind of a strategic reassurance. But that's very difficult to attain, almost impossible at the moment.
Obviously, there are a lot of political differences between two countries, but I do see there are a bunch of cultural differences in terms of way of thinking, in terms of way of how to define something, how to define whether we are competitors or not, and also in this point in terms of whether we can set up a strategic reassurance. Qin Guo said maybe it sounds a bit too abstract. What's the take from the side of the United States? From my point of view, from my understandings, China always said, okay, let's don't talk about this. We are not competitors. We could be friends. Let's talk about philosophy. Let's talk about the old history of 2,000 years. Let's talk about human collective community. But the United States said, no. Let's stick to very concrete point, to mutual relations, to crisis management, to Taiwan Strait, to the timing of conflict. So, China, ocean people, Eastern people, they are talking, ranting about the big things. But Western people, they are sticking to very concrete points, despite all these political differences. And also at this point, I think Chinese president say, we don't have plan, but we have a certain preconditions. And the United States says, okay, let's talk about preconditions. Then China says, oh, so all these preconditions might look too abstract. Am I right or am I right? Bonnie and Tom?
Bonnie, did you want to say something?
I'm always happy to weigh in. From my perspective, the United States under the Biden administration has been very consistent in its approach toward China from the beginning. And there has never been an ambition to somehow agree on what the nature of the relationship is like. As you say, that's a sort of Eastern thing, you know. And I disagree with you, Peter, that it is essential for our two countries to agree on the nature of this relationship. What is more important is that we understand that we have differences of interest. We have things that could bring us into blows, frankly, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but potentially in the South China Sea. We have a treaty with the Philippines. China's putting a lot of pressure on the Philippines around Second Thomas Shoal. And I can tell you that the president's talked about that as well. And President Biden reminded Xi Jinping that we have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. And if a Philippine soldier gets shot, we're going to be there. And I think it's a really good thing that our leaders actually talk very directly and candidly with each other. They've had a relationship, as you know, for a very long time. And their personalities are such that they both speak very directly. And so, yes, I think crisis communications are important. Drawing lessons from mistakes that are made are important. I think both sides learned some lessons from the balloon incident, which makes me a little bit more confident that we would not handle that kind of episode the same way if it happened again or something similar. We'd probably make other mistakes. But I think it is these concrete things that are important in really finding ways to manage differences and prevent conflict. I don't think it's going to help resolve anything if our two leaders just say, oh, okay, our relationship is defined by cooperation, not by competition. First of all, it's not true. And that's dangerous if you actually describe something in a way that's not true. But more importantly, what does it solve? How does that help you avoid conflict? So I think that the administration has been right from the beginning to say we need guardrails, we need better communication channels. And over time, I think that the approach has been proven right. We've had 3 rounds of talks between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi. And that has become a very important channel between our two countries. And if we did have a crisis, I think we would turn to that channel to have those two individuals connect and see if we could manage the crisis. So, yes, I think we have a different way of looking at things, but I'm glad that China has come around to agree to many of the initiatives that the Biden administration has been proposing over the last 3 years.
Tingguo, do you think all this disagreement mostly goes back to cultural differences in terms of that we see this differently in terms of cultural aspect, or there are some other factors behind that?
Well, I think certainly culture plays a role in this. In Chinese culture, we don't talk about competition, especially in public. We don't have competitive elections. And we want to maintain faith to create more room for compromise. But we do compete very fiercely under the table.
Exactly.
So competition is the reality, but you don't want. But
that's very difficult for American.
Yeah, but on surface, you want to maintain the state of harmony, atmosphere of harmony, in a way to create more rooms for compromise. But the other side of it is not related to competition. That is, competition can be defined in different ways. Okay? Mm-hmm. You have, a fair competition, or benign competition, mm-hmm. and you have, vicious competition. Okay, mm-hmm. or race to the bottom type. During Trump's time, the competition was practice more or less along the vicious competition track. So there is no ethics, no bottom line when you come to competition. Smear the other party and demonize the other party as part of the competition. But benign competition is like Olympics, when people have the same rules and try to come up as much fair as a judge, in terms of judgment. So I think benign competition is not bad. But the problem is it can be veered into negative competition easily if you believe that the end justifies the means. So I think China and the US, if they agree on competition, they should agree on the terms of competition. Never smear and demonize the other, or intentionally, and at the same time we compete. I think compete for the better is in the best interest of everybody. Compete for the worse. That's not something that you want to do.
If I could add just something on the cultural styles.
Sure.
Interesting what you said, Professor. There are undoubtedly differences in cultural styles, and the American style comes across maybe as excessively critical of China and shrill sometimes. But at least I think there is something positive, if I may say so, on both sides, in that neither of us at the end of the day have a strong, dislike of Chinese culture or American culture, I think, or the American people or the Chinese people. You don't sense any kind of these visceral, irrational hatreds that you see so often in the Middle East. That's a very positive thing, I think. So I think we can take some comfort in that. Some of the petty prejudices that existed in this country, towards Asians, 100 years or so ago, they're really a thing of the past. So, and that's a plus, I think, if we're looking on the, engaging the pluses and minuses of the relationship.
I have a few questions from the panelists, from the participants. One of the questions is very closely linked to what we just talked about in terms of war over Taiwan Strait. The question was very simple. The war in Taiwan depends on future of the war in Ukraine, right?
No.
No.
I don't see that kind of connection. People have asked themselves, what's the impact of the war on Russia, Ukraine? I think some people think, if anything, maybe it's made China somewhat more cautious in the sense that, it's a reminder that war is difficult. The Russians have not had an easy time there. They tried to have in the beginning of the war, they didn't succeed. So, again, I don't think anyone was thinking that, a direct attack on Taiwan is in the near future is likely. Certainly, I don't think that's the case. But that's one takeaway, I think, from the Ukraine war. Now, maybe it reminds us all that the United States can be pulled in various directions. It's being pulled right now towards Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East. And so maybe that leaves some room for Chinese maneuver in Asia, in the abstract. But I don't see a direct link between the war in Ukraine and the Taiwan scenario.
Maybe in terms of the motivation outside of China to make the war, so which might depend on the future of Ukraine war. Buddy, what do you think?
I would just say that I understand Taiwan's position. We have heard officials in Taiwan say that it's Ukraine today and Taiwan tomorrow, and the future of Ukraine is existential for Taiwan. I can put myself in their shoes and understand why they see it that way. They want to see our Congress continue to supply weapons because that's an indicator for them as to whether or not we will supply weapons to them, whether we will do more to help them. I think they're quite fearful of the United States becoming war weary, being really supportive of Ukraine, and then after a while saying, nah, we've given enough. It's time for them to fight this war by themselves. It's Europe's war. We don't care anymore. That is very scary to the people of Taiwan. But that said, I think the reality is that there isn't much of a connection between the Ukraine war and Taiwan's own security. It is possible that the United States believes that some war is one that we should not be involved in, or we should have limited involvement in. And yet the war in the Taiwan Strait, maybe they think we should be all in. So, I mean, there certainly could be differences. But again, I understand Taiwan's position and why they're worried. But I think there are few analogies between the war in Ukraine and a possible war in the Taiwan Strait, from my perspective.
There's another question for Bonnie. The question is, it seems that in the past few months, including during APEC, the two countries went more closely than ever. How do you think about the US-China relation in the next few months or in the next year, considering the election in Taiwan and the 2024 presidential election in the United States? What are the motivations for both China and the US to stabilize bilateral relations, as Biden said, manage the competition?
Well, I think I've already explained that the Biden administration from day one wanted to manage the competition with China. And it has stuck to that ask in all of its conversations with Chinese officials. But the U.S. does have motivations to stabilize the bilateral relationship. We're going into a presidential campaign. We will not have a summit between our leaders next year. This is a good time to have our leaders get together and come to some kind of an understanding that we will try to keep this relationship on an even keel, at least over the course of the next year. We'll see whether that holds. But that we will have our officials continue to talk to each other about issues like maritime differences, Asia-Pacific issues, artificial intelligence. I mean, there are so many things that we really can and should talk about. So for the motivations on the Chinese side, I think the United States believes that China's economic headwinds and the technology restrictions that are being imposed by the United States and some of its allies are motivating China to seek stability in this relationship, that China really needs a breathing space. Tsinghua can tell us whether he agrees with that or not. But I don't know what will happen to U.S.-China relations in the next few months or the next year. I hope we will manage the election in Taiwan well. And I hope we don't have any errant spy balloons flying over the United States or other unexpected developments. And I think that both countries have at least come to some minimal understandings that could maybe last for a time. But at the end of the day, Peter, I think it's tactical. And I never expected any strategic understanding to be reached between these two leaders. It would be irresponsible for either country to set that as an expectation. There are so many differences between the U.S. and China, and they're only getting bigger. And our competition is global. I will point out that China is working around the clock, all around the world, to undermine and damage the United States' reputation, to weaken U.S. relationships with our allies. I mean, this is just a fact. And the one sentence in the national security strategy and the China strategy speech that Anthony Blinken gave is really worth repeating because it underpins the entire U.S. approach to China. The United States sees China as the only country with both the will and the capability to revise the international order in ways that would be damaging and detrimental to the United States and its allies. And this judgment is guiding U.S. approach toward China.
Since you mentioned a couple of times this spy balloon, so let me go to the point very briefly. Don't you think that the way of dealing with this balloon crisis at the beginning of this year from the side of the United States was, please forgive me to use the word, was to some degree not very professional, especially since we consider, how everything was bright after the summit in Bali on the 14th of November last year. And everything was very well prepared. And then Secretary Clinton was about to visit Beijing in January. And all of a sudden, this balloon crisis happened. Everyone knows, no matter whether it was a spy balloon, and say at the end of the day, I was told it has been proven to be not a spy balloon.
That's not true. It was a spy balloon that wasn't functioning.
I see. Okay. Even if, as you said, was it truly necessary to the leak? I mean, Tom, you were engaged in intelligence community. As a professional, people want to leak because everyone is doing that. Why suddenly to make it as a public news? And
it wasn't leaked by the administration, Peter. There were American citizens who looked up in the sky, saw it, took a photo, and put it out on the internet on a video.
Yeah, but so could there have been a more political way of dealing that? Try to avoid, try to make sure that all this political preparation, after the Bali summit won't be destroyed. Or maybe I'm wrong. I'm not.
I'm going to say one sentence, and then I'm going to let Tom give you the appropriate diplomatic answer. But I will give you one sentence. If China saw a balloon of that size with that capability flying over its territory, it would have shot it down.
Actually, after the United States released that, almost every country, every party leaked, we used to have this balloon. Even Taiwan mentioned, we used to have this balloon many years ago from some countries, but which no one mentioned before. All of a sudden, in February, in middle of February, at the end of February, at least as I read about, Germany said we used to have this, Taiwan said we used to have this, Belgium said we used to have this, from many countries. And now no one is talking about this anymore. We know something like that is happening almost every day. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not expert. Tom, you are expert for intelligence. Tell me.
Well, I was expert decades ago, but not so much now. But my understanding is there are satellites that go around countries all the time, and no one does anything about that because that's just understood that it's legitimate espionage. The balloon incident it's something of a gray zone, I think. I don't know how high, airspace goes over countries. And so I don't even know whether it was, outside the norms or not. I think Bonnie is right in that it was visible in the United States. And it was, once it was seen there, the administration, did have to react to it, I think. Professor mentioned, the importance of face in Chinese culture. Well, it was at play there, I think, for the United States also. I think it's an issue that should be discussed in the future. There's just something so physical and tangible about a balloon right over one's territory, even though, of course, satellites at a higher level do that all the time. So I can't give you a clear, view on whether that's appropriate behavior or not. But it was, it certainly got America's attention. I'm not sure it was really worth. From what I understood, President Xi, we were told back here in the U.S., was unhappy with, the balloon going over U.S. territory. Maybe it wasn't intended to do that initially, so there were some reports it blew off course, but it did disrupt the train of meetings that had been decided upon. Secretary Blinken had to put off his visit. So it's something I think should be discussed in the future. It's a reminder that these issues are sensitive. China is sensitive about the U.S. reconnaissance flights that fly up and down their coast, not very far off their coast, although they're legal according to international law. And the United States could say to China, although I don't think it does, they said, well, we're doing something that's legal. You could do the same thing. But they don't. Of course, China doesn't have the basing agreements that the United States does have out in Asia. So it's a kind of asymmetrical capability there. Although, there's Cuba down there. I don't know what's going to happen to that in the future in its relationship to China. Did the U.S. overreact? Well, I don't know. Still, it's pretty tangible up there and not so far up.
If you would have been still sitting in the office in terms of intelligence community, Tom, would you have done in the same way, in a similar way, or would you have done in a different way? I mean, the way of dealing with this crisis at the beginning of this year from outside of the United States.
Well, if you mean if I were Chinese, if I were American.
No, if you're American, if you are still.
If I were American, right.
Yeah.
Well, if I were in the intelligence community and the balloon was over the U.S., I would be quickly reminded that I don't have much to say in this, because it becomes a policy issue right away. In fact, it goes right up to the president. So, at most, intelligence officials might say, well, they're trying to get their reconnaissance on some of our nuclear programs. And at the end of the day, it's not that sensitive, that the information that they're likely to get. This is not, a vital interest necessarily, but it takes on a political dimension, immediately. And their intelligence officers don't, they're shown to the back of the room under those circumstances.
Okay, Qingguo, maybe it's your turn. As I mentioned before, maybe because I used to be a journalist, I always tend to ask these simplified questions. Please forgive all these simplified questions. But I ask these questions because I want to figure out maybe the eventual mechanism between our two nations, try to avoid such kind of incident to happen again.
Well,
Okay.
First of all, I think I think the balloon incident, how it was handled, was a reflection of the political distrust between the two countries.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much suspicion that this small incident sparked all kinds of reactions, and the Biden administration, I think, was taken by surprise at the beginning, and also suspicion gives the reason to think about all kinds of possibilities, and then waited and finally shut it down, and then went through the examination of the wreckage, and then decided that it was not used to spy the U.S. Actually, even if it was used to spy the U.S., I mean, it will not have any significant intelligence value to China, as Mr. Parker said. So in the future, how are we going to handle this kind of situation? I think the two sides. Another problem with the previous handling was that there was no effective communication. Also, in part because of the intense distrust, and now we have reestablished some of the communications. So that's probably would help. probably in the days to come, if we face another surprise, I think first of all, the two sides should talk to each other. And secondly, we should give the benefit of doubt and wait before we draw any conclusions, and should not exaggerate. Let issues to explode and affect other areas of the relationship. So whether we can do that or not, it depends.
Yes, that's
if
a
we
good
have,
thing.
if we have the Republicans in office in next year, probably we are going to repeat the same thing, and probably even worse would happen. It seems to me.
So, Bonnie, will we talk first next time, or just let it happen?
I'm not sure that makes any sense. There are many aspects of this issue that haven't been discussed and are probably not appropriate to discuss here. But it's not correct to say that this balloon had no potential capability to collect meaningful intelligence. The U-2 photo clearly indicated that it carried signals intelligence equipment. So there's the intent of what was behind this balloon is quite clear. And China should have fessed up very quickly. I give China credit for its immediate statement. It took only about 24 hours for the foreign ministry to figure out what had happened, because it had no clue what was going on, didn't even know China had a spy balloon program, and came back to the United States. And then in a statement, after talking with U.S. officials at the State Department, it said that China regretted this incident. And this is where I think the United States made a mistake. That it is so unusual, so rare for China to say that they regret something that they have done, that we should have understood that this was a signal that China knew that it had made a mistake. And it wanted to diffuse the incident and not have it escalate into a bigger crisis. But our domestic politics determined the development of that crisis, in my view. And so, as I said, I think both sides learned some lessons from this crisis. Hopefully, we would do better next time. But importantly, we have put this crisis behind us. The balloon was not discussed at the Biden-Xi Jinping summit, and I think we've finally, our officials have stopped talking about it. So maybe we should move on.
Okay. There are more questions on the way from a side of our participant, but time flies. We have last 5 minutes, last 4 minutes. So let me just pick up the last questions. So we have seen a lot of signals from U.S.-China engagement recently, like California governor visit China or Wang Yi's visit to the U.S. before the Biden-Xi summit. How long this deterrent between the U.S.-China could sustain? What are the domestic drivers from both sides for this engagement? So maybe let's start still with Bonnie first, and then Tom and Qingguo.
I already answered that question, so I'll turn over the floor to Qingguo, and he can comment whether he agrees with my analysis of the motivations on the Chinese side.
Well, I think there's a huge demand for resumption of the relationship among the people, and also on part of the government at the time. It's in our interest to have a stable international environment. I don't quite agree that we are competing with the US all over the world. Actually, it's a matter of perception. Whatever China does can be seen as a kind of a competition. it's like you come up with a strategy, and whatever that falls into the strategy is believed to be part of the strategy. But China needs a stable international environment. That's for sure. And we need for China to secure a stable international environment, we need to develop a stable and even, if possible, cooperative relationship with the U.S. So this is what's driving this kind of view is driving the efforts on the part of China to reach out to the U.S. Or to accept the U.S. Efforts to also to do the same in some areas. But we must remember that there are strong forces in both countries who are opposed to this kind of efforts. And so the balance of power is changing all the time. So I hope that the forces for cooperation, for stabilization and cooperation, would prevail in the future.
Okay, I have the last questions in terms of a very tiny issue. In the readout of the White House yesterday, mentioned two words. Two words were mentioned. One is saying there are a wide range of issues discussed about. It was a candid and a constructive, but previously there was always three words: candid, substantive, and constructive, and also in the right order. But this time there was no word substantive. Was it forgotten by the coincidence, or is it because there was no substantive issues touched at all for the perception of the White House? Maybe I'm too simplified again. Just trying to make a very tiny discourse analysis. Bonnie or Tom?
Well, candid usually means there are disagreements.
Exactly. Yeah, and constructive means we're still moving forwards. But a substantive,
You're right.
This word wasn't mentioned yesterday in the readout of the White House, which never has been the case before.
I don't know. I'd like to think it really doesn't mean that much, the fact that the word wasn't there. But there may be a different point of view from our other panelists.
Bonnie, do you have some reading or not?
I tend to agree with Tom. I don't think it's that significant. I think that there was a good exchange of views. Some of the issues were touched on very lightly. There were only 4 hours. There were 3 different baskets of issues, and they set aside time to talk about things. And some of the conversations between Wang Yi when he had visited Washington were in fact more substantive, more in-depth, not surprisingly, on issues like the war in Gaza and Ukraine. These were not very, very deeply discussed between the presidents, as I understand it, but they had a very substantive exchange on Taiwan. And they had a substantive exchange on other issues. So yeah, I wouldn't read too much into it. I don't know. I guess my question to you is: does the Chinese readout use the exact same words?
No,
they don't.
It's always the case. Chinese use, the Chinese version of these 3 words, and American use these 3 words in English. But this time there was no this kind of version on the Chinese readout. But also the English word substantive was missing in the English version of the readout from the White House. Maybe.
So what were the words used in the Chinese readout?
全面的 integrative or comprehensive, 战略的战略性的 strategic, and 方向性的 long run orientation or what? Yeah,
Yes, but no, the adjectives were a candid and in-depth exchange of views on strategic overall and directional issues. So strategic overall and directional are adjectives describing issues, but the 2 words that were used to describe the exchange of views were candid and in-depth.
I see. Okay, we need to close, and Chingo needs to leave, and the body's tired. It's time to sleep in DC. Yeah, it's time to eat lunch here in Hong Kong and in Beijing. Okay,
you're
thank you
lucky.
so much. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
For this
Thank you,
brilliant,
Peter.
intellectual and insightful conversation. Okay, you may leave.
Thank you so much.
Guys, you may leave. And Sheldon
Okay.
is online. Sheldon is online, and he needs to
Okay.
run up. Okay.
Good to see
Bye-bye.
you.
Yes.
Take care,
Okay, good night.
everyone.
And good night.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you.